Hi guys, it's that time of the month again, it's wrap-up time, but this is again going to be one of my reading highlights videos for the month of July and August, because I just read so much crap in the last 2 months that it is just not worth talking about. In the last 2 months I primarily read self-published books, and don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing self-published books in general. On the contrary, I've found some real gems that way. But it is just an unfortunate fact that you have to wade through a lot of crap before you happen upon one of the gems. It reminds me of the first rounds of one of those casting shows like American Idol or German Idol for that matter, where half the people on there, half the contestants make you go, oh my god, girl, you really need to fire your friends and family, because they clearly do not care about you if they let you walk out onto that stage at the skill level you are at and let you embarrass yourself in front of the public. That's not being supportive. That's bordering on criminal negligence. TLDW, most July-August books self-published and really bad, therefore only reading highlights now. I'm going to start with what is probably the most interesting book to you in this bunch, and that is The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris. I picked this up as soon as it was published and I could get my hands on it because it sounded interesting and it came recommended by Oprah. It's an Oprah's book club pick. And not that her recommendations are always without fail awesome, but they usually are, and they usually are good and interesting books. And then while I was still reading it, the Booker long list was published, and I didn't expect this book to be on that list. I never would have thought of it as a candidate, but it was, and I'm pretty happy about it. This is set in Georgia in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War. Slavery has been abolished just days ago, and all enslaved persons are set free and in many cases suddenly cut loose. And while some of them chose to remain on their plantations and continue there as paid workers, others immediately began a long journey north to what they hoped were better job markets and a more friendly environment in general. And yet others just roamed the countryside trying to figure out what exactly to do with their newfound freedom and their lives. The book opens with a chance encounter in the forest between two such freedmen, two brothers, and their neighbor, or the neighbor of their former owner, who owns a large property himself but has never cultivated it and owned no slaves. And he offers them a job and a place to stay, more than anything else out of a feeling of desperate loneliness, because he has just lost a son to the war. And this rather unpopular choice rattles and polarizes his small town community. In the end, this is the story of a handful of people who are each in their own way at odds with the norms, the values, the conventions, and the interests of the society around them, and are trying and have tried in the past to carve out a niche for themselves, a niche that will let them live life according to their own values, their own personalities, and their own interests. It is a very quiet story, and there's nothing whatsoever exaggerated about it, but it is nevertheless quite dramatic, but it unfolds in a very realistic way. The only thing about this book that felt a bit contrived to me is actually its language, its style. It is written in a lush and lyrical prose that to me didn't really feel like the author's own voice, but rather like that of the great American novelists that he is apparently trying and succeeding to emulate. It reads like an improved Steinbeck, and kudos for that, I guess, but it also feels just a little bit quaint and weird. But other than that, amazing book, and I guess I'd really like to see it on the Booker shortlist. And now for something completely different, the Borealis Investigations series, which is an amazing crime/romantic suspense series by Gregory Ashe. And I'm so glad that I finally found a book by Gregory Ashe again that I loved. I read my first Gregory Ashe last autumn, which was Stray Fears, which is a standalone folk horror novel set in Louisiana. Absolutely amazing, but his most popular series, the Hazard&Somerset series, well, the first book, did absolutely nothing for me, left me mostly indifferent, and I actually thought that the first book in the Lion and Lamb series, The Same Breath, was actually rather bad and cliche-ridden. And so I was a little bit apprehensive when I picked up the Borealis series, but it is absolutely amazing. The original trilogy consists of the books Orientation, Triangulation, and Declination, and it has an overarching storyline. The first two books also have a Monster of the Week thing going on, although it is not paranormal, it's a strictly contemporary crime series. And the third book is completely dedicated to the overarching storyline, which is that of a serial killer, which used to be active when the protagonists, two private investigators, were in college. They are now in their late 20s. And one of the two protagonists is actually the serial killer's final boy, his last victim, the one that got away. And this experience in his past is a big reason why he decided to team up with his best friend from college and become his partner in his private investigation business. Another big reason is, of course, that they are best friends and they have been in love with each other from their first year in college on. But because they are both stupid, especially one of them, circumstances have always kept them apart, and it is another overarching storyline of this trilogy how their relationship progresses. And both of the protagonists are incredibly entertaining and incredibly lovable. They have an opposites attract thing going on, and one of them is what I think Roman Slendia would call a cinnamon roll. He's quite tough and butch on the outside and incredibly sweet on the inside. And the other one is like a hipster if hipsters were sincere and authentic. And the two of them are permanently bickering and bantering, exaggeratedly so. There is a lot of exaggeration with the characters and their interactions going on in the series, deliberate exaggeration. But in spite of that, and in spite of all the humor in the books, there are some serious issues and there's some serious heartbreak going on in the books for the characters and also for the reader. I absolutely loved it. Binged the first trilogy and the fourth book, or the first book in the follow-up series, and I am so glad that Gregory Ashe has decided to carry on with this series. And I think there are now 4 or even 5 books out in the second Borealis series, Borealis Without a Compass it is called. But do not start with the fourth Borealis book, the first in the new series, which is called Indirection. Do not start there. It is absolutely bonkers, and you need to be familiar with the characters in order to enjoy that book. So please, if you're interested in this, do start with the original trilogy. The next book that I want to talk about is The Bayou by Arden Powell. And this is a bit of a funny twist because last autumn I recommended a spooky folk horror novella by Arden Powell together with Gregory Ashe's Stray Fears, which, like I mentioned earlier, is folk horror set in rural Louisiana. And now this novella by Arden Powell is also folk horror or folkish horror set in Louisiana. The The protagonist, Eugene, is a photographer and reporter in a small town by the Bayou, and there, in the dark days of the summer of 1935, people have begun to disappear. Weird water stains have appeared, and the water in the bayou is rising. And on top of all that, a pair of Bonnie and Clyde-like serial bank robbers are incoming. This was a really, really great short read. It has amazing characters, and again, like that other spooky novella by Arden Powell that I recommended last year, The Fairy Hounds of York, it has a very intense and almost tangible atmosphere. In this case, the cloying and almost suffocating humid heat of Louisiana in summer. Its central premise was a little bit cheap, though, mainly because it is one that is very common in American horror stories. But in this case, it was handled very tactfully. And I guess overall, I can say now that I'm a fan of Arden Powell's work. And you've probably all at least heard of this novella from 1972, The Stepford Wives by Levin. This is a satirical look at the gender roles in the affluent middle class in suburban and small town America. The protagonist, Joanna, moves with her husband and their two small kids from the city to the small town of Stepford, and there everything is awful. Joanna is appalled by the women in the neighborhood who are little more than automatons. All they care about and all they are passionate about is housework. And Joanna's husband spends more and more time in the man cave of the town's men's society, or whatever it is called. And after a couple of months, even the two friends that Joanna has made, and who are both more or less rebel girls, at least when compared to the rest of Stepford, even those two succumb to the spirit of the place and change quite suddenly and become single-minded housewives as well. Or they are changed, because their transformation doesn't seem quite natural to Joanna, and she begins to suspect that something very sinister is going on in Stepford. I liked how nothing was neatly wrapped up in the end and nothing was neatly solved in this novella, and I liked how it only touches upon its themes, even though these themes are not exactly mind-blowing nowadays. But I think this was more than just interesting from a historical point of view, history of literature point of view. It was genuinely enjoyable and funny, and even quite a bit more creepy than I would have expected. But approximately 10,000 levels above and beyond that in creepiness was Subcutanean by Aaron R. Reed. This is a horror novel, or at least it's a creepy mindfuck. Two college students who live off campus discover a door to a secret basement in their house, which opens to a seemingly infinite maze which contains portals that seem to lead to alternate realities, alternate universes. This was an absolute creepy page turner. I always read it late at night, and on the one hand, that was the best time to read it because it's just that kind of book, the book that is read best late at night, because that's just the right atmosphere for it. On the other hand, that is also the worst possible time to read it because you won't be able to sleep. I loved how engaging the story was, and that it did keep me up so late at night, and that I almost couldn't stop reading it, because that is such a rare thing for me these days. But on the other hand, it also gave me this deflating feeling in the end when a great mystery doesn't wrap up in a way that is satisfactory. And you know, when you get the resolution to a mystery and you learn how things are, you start to question the components of the story, and you go like, okay, if things are like that, then how does this element really fit in there. And I got the feeling that the author didn't fully think things through. It also ends quite abruptly, and in hindsight, I also thought that since this is first-person narration, there should have been more comments by the narrator, maybe comments that you understand only when the story wraps up, but there should have been comments about the outcome and the takeaway of all of this ordeal that the two college students go through. I can't really say more than that without spoiling everything, but if anybody has read the book, I'd be only too happy to talk about it, especially because there is also a gimmick that comes with the book and its publications. I've already mentioned earlier that we have a multiple worlds, universes, realities thing going on here, and the gimmick pays tribute to that because no two copies of the book that are sold are the same. So the author picked a handful or two handfuls of elements in the story which are variable, but the variations are not so drastic, at least that's what the author said, not so drastic that it changes the story overall. I actually thought that at least one of the variations that my copy apparently had that are different in other versions was really quite significant when it comes to the impact that the story, I think, has on the main character. But I can't say anything about that either because huge spoiler. In the end, I'd say that this is an engrossing, creepy, atmospheric mindfuck of a horror trip, but I think it needed to have been and deserved to have been just a bit more ambitious. And now for something completely frivolous again, I discovered a great, funny, entertaining, and so cute contemporary romance series by Anita Sunday called Signs of Love. I've read 3 books in it now, and the first one, Leo Meets Aries, is by far the cutest and funniest and most entertaining one. So yes, the signs here are zodiac signs, so we have a kind of fated mates thing going on in each book, but the characters never talk a lot about astrology because the thing with this series and with each of the books is that the protagonist, or at least one of the protagonists, is usually completely clueless, and it is one of the persons in their environment, like a relative or a friend, who is into astrology and is trying to make the protagonist see what the stars have in store for him. But this way, the astrology is always on the periphery of the story. So if you're not into astrology, this won't hamper your enjoyment of the story. There is not much more to it than that, but it's all about the characters and the cuteness of how the story develops. So if you're into that kind of thing, so I can only recommend that you look into the first book in the series and see how you like it. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. So these were my reading highlights of the last 2 months, July and August. As always, if you've read any of these books, if you are interested in any of these books, or if I have made you interested in any of these books, do let me know in the comments. And fingers crossed for Nathan Harris and The Sweetness of Water. Bye guys, I'll see you very soon.